This is TV 10 and 55 Focus, a program dealing with issues affecting everyone on Long Island and the tri-state area. Now your host, Richard Rose.
Hi, I'm Richard Rose, and welcome to Focus. This past week, the President delivered his third State of the Union address, although some people say it was more campaign speech than State of the Union address.
Let there be no doubt. America is determined to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and I will take no options off the table to achieve that goal.
Tough talk on Iran was one of the few moments last night where Republicans and Democrats alike cheered the President's words. Political analyst Lawrence Levy's not surprised. He says heading into the fall presidential election, President Obama wasn't just delivering a State of the Union address.
Oh, this was a campaign speech. If you're a Democrat, you loved it. If you're a Republican, you hated it. It helped rally Obama's liberal base, which a candidate has to do, but it also made inroads, started building those bridges to the moderate swing voters, many of whom live in suburban communities like Long Island.
The president's call for higher taxes on millionaires and billionaires was instantly dismissed by Republicans as class warfare and divisive. Levy says it may signal that little will get accomplished in Washington this year.
There were a lot of areas of potential common ground with Republicans, particularly on cutting taxes, developing oil resources, renewable energy. But the reality is that this is a campaign year. There's too much at stake for the parties. They don't want to seem weak with their own supporters.
And speaking of that, we begin with our guest, one of the president's supporters, Representative Tim Bishop, Congressman Tim Bishop, in his fifth term now.
Yep.
Representing Long Island, Southampton, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Richard.
First of all, what did you think of the president's speech? Campaign speech, or was there substance there?
I think there was a great deal of substance there. I think it's hard to, escape politics in an even-numbered year, but I think there was a great deal of substance there, and I also think there was a great deal there that Republicans and Democrats ought to be able to agree on and ought to be able to move forward on.
Such as? Because, people are anticipating a do-nothing Congress.
I'll just give you one. I mean, the president proposed a, quote, all of the above energy policy. That is precisely the precise name of the energy policy proposals that the Republicans have been trumpeting since the summer of 2008. So if the president is endorsing it, Republicans have already endorsed it almost unanimously. I think this is something that we should be able to work on.
Well, you see a couple of ways in which they seem to talk the same language, but then somehow there's no deal. For instance, he talked about what was an apparent reference just yesterday out on the campaign trail, that he would like to tap into all the available natural gas that has been discovered just below the surface in numerous parts of the country in a process that's usually used. It's called hydrofracking. Yeah. A lot of environmentalists have concerns it could contaminate the water table. Yet on the other hand, he seems very open to tapping into that, something Republicans, conservatives, and big business really want to see move forward.
I think it has to be very seriously considered, and I think at least here in New York, Governor Cuomo has the approach to hydrofracking exactly right. What he's saying is let's get the science right, let's make a science-based decision, and let's move forward in a way that reasonable people can support. There are some issues with respect to the water table. There are also some issues with respect to what do you do with all the wastewater that's created. We have had hearings on this in the committee that I'm the senior Democrat on, and there are some real issues about how do you dispose of this. Are our existing sewage treatment plants equipped to dispose of this?
Because some of that could come into even our own sewage treatment plants.
Indeed.
We're hearing, and there's heavy metals involved.
Indeed, and there's the question of whether you allow states to set their own standards or whether you have a minimum national standard for clean water, and all of these things need to be assessed. That's not to say that hydrofracking is bad. I mean, it is a plentiful source of energy. It is being developed all over the country. Pennsylvania has made a big effort in this regard, and I think it has to be part of our energy portfolio going forward. We just have to do it in a way, as I say, that reasonable people can consider to be the right way to approach it.
Now, some on the other side would say, okay, but that's going to take time, the way you laid that out, looking into the science and making sure it's safe. We could tap into some profits and some jobs right away if we were to approve the Keystone Pipeline, which the president put off again, saying that another route should be considered.
I think what the president had a figurative gun held to his head. I mean, he was told that he had to approve it within 60 days, and I think what the president said is that this is a decision that can't be made in the responsible way it should be made within 60 days. He didn't deny it. He didn't approve it. He simply said that he needed more time than the 60 days that had been imposed on him by the legislation that we passed, which, by the way, I voted for back in December.
So you do favor the Keystone Pipeline?
I think that the president's approach is the right approach, which is let's make sure we're doing the right thing here. Let's make sure we're pursuing this resource in an environmentally responsible way, and let's make sure we're not going to solve one problem at the expense of creating other problems. I think that's the right approach for the pipeline. I think it's the right approach for fracking. I think it's the right approach for offshore deep water drilling. I mean, look at what we had to deal with when the BP well blew up. I mean, that was an environmental disaster of almost incalculable proportions. There are ways that we can go forward that can prevent that kind of environmental disaster that if we approach our decision-making process in a more deliberate way.
Okay, so now that issue even itself was tied to something that's been debated for months, and now you'll be back at it again, the extension of the unemployment benefits and the 2% cut in the payroll tax, which was extended for 2 months after this incredible standoff again in December, which many feel the president came out ahead in when Republicans first opposed the deal and then backed off and agreed to a 2-month extension.
I think
what's going to happen with that?
Well, I think we absolutely have to extend it. We have until the 29th of February. I think to impose a tax increase of $160 billion on working class, middle class Americans, I think is simply at this time is simply wrong, and we have to approve a full year extension of the Social Security reduction, withholding reduction. The fact that we have so many people out of work through no fault of their own, we have to increase or extend the unemployment compensation. I would also say that most economists, Republican economists, conservative economists, will tell us that the most stimulative thing we can do in terms of government intervention is unemployment compensation. You don't need
people spend the money right
people
away.
You don't need to have a Nobel Prize in economics to figure out that if you put money in the hands of people who are living paycheck to paycheck, they're going to spend it. And 70% of our economy is rooted in consumer spending. So if we can help these people not only cover the day-to-day necessities of life, but stimulate the economy, that's a good thing to do. And as far as the Medicare reimbursement fix, for doctors, we absolutely have to do that as well. I mean, we have 48 million Americans who are dependent on access to physicians for their Medicare services. If we cut the reimbursement rate by 29%, which is what will happen if we don't extend it, physicians quite understandably are going to say we can't afford to treat these patients, and that's going to deny access to medical services for 48 million Americans.
Which is how we wound up with $15 trillion in debt in this country, is that we have these programs that nobody can say no to, that all of us, I like getting that 2% payroll tax cut in my paycheck, by the way. I think everybody does. None of us would ever voluntarily give it up. When do we deal with the consequences?
We have a twofold
of this
problem
stuff?
here. We have a twofold problem. We have job one is to put this country back to work, and job one is to stimulate spending in this country, which will stimulate the economy, which will create a virtuous cycle. If we have more people spending, they will have that will increase the demand for goods and services. That will require the purveyors of those goods and services to add staff in order to provide those goods and services. If we have more people working, we have more money in circulation, and it will create a virtuous cycle, with the kind of cycle that we had in the 90s that led to the prosperity that we had throughout the 90s.
So the stimulus is the way back to health?
No, let me finish my point. Okay, but what we also need to do is, once we get the economy moving in the right direction, and we are slowly making that progress. I mean, the report that came out this morning, fourth quarter GDP increase at 2.8% as opposed to a third quarter increase of 1.8%. So we're slowly making progress. We have a long way to go, and all of us wish it would accelerate. But we also have to very quickly, once we get the economy moving in the right direction, we have to very quickly pivot to a long-term effort to rein in our spending and, frankly, increase our revenue so that we can bring our budget into balance. I'm one of 100 members of Congress that signed a letter, 60 Democrats, 40 Republicans, that urged the super committee this past fall, to go big, to not just settle for $1.2 to $1.5 trillion worth of deficit reduction, but to go to $4 trillion in deficit reduction. Put everything on the table, everything associated with revenue, everything associated with expense, and work our way towards a $4 trillion reduction in our deficit.
We have to take a break, but we'll talk about that when we come back, because that issue has not gone away. It's another one of the issues that Congress will have to take up when the Congressman returns to Washington. Stay with us and our guest, Congressman Tim Bishop, right here on Focus.
TV 10 and 55 Focus now continues.
And we're back with Congressman Tim Bishop, and we're talking about this thorny issue, how to get the economy going, and at the same time try to deal with the enormous amount of debt that we have in this country. And Congressman, you say you were one of the folks in Congress that wanted to go for even bigger attempt to deal with the deficit of $4 trillion. What is it really possible to cut $4 trillion from the U.S.?
It doesn't have to be cuts. I mean, this is deficit reduction, and I think one of the problems, first off, is it possible? Yes, it's possible. Secondly, what I would say is that the focus thus far has been exclusively on cutting expenditures as opposed to looking at other sources of revenue. And I think what the President said in the State of the Union message is something that we have to pay very serious attention to. We absolutely have to reform our corporate profit structure. I mean, the fact that legally a multinational corporation like Exxon, that generated $40 billion in profits, pays an effective tax rate of 0.4% legally. That's wrong. There's something wrong with that. The fact that another multinational corporation that generated billions of dollars in after-tax revenue called General Electric paid zero taxes in the last year. That's wrong. The fact that we reward companies that outsource their jobs, we give them a tax preference to outsource their jobs, that's wrong. And we have to fix these things. No reasonable person can say that it makes sense to reward a company that sends jobs overseas. So that there's revenue there that we have to realize by virtue of reforming our tax code. So it's not just about cutting expenditures. We have to make reasonable cuts. I've supported the reasonable cuts that have thus far come before the Congress. But if it's just cutting, if the goal is to just cut, people need to understand we spend about $3.7 trillion a year. We take in about $2.4 trillion. If we're going to balance our budget, that means we're going to have a $2.4 trillion federal budget. And what that means is that we can pretty much do Social Security, Medicare, defense, veterans benefits, and interest on the national debt, and that covers about $2.4 trillion. So I think most people want more from the federal government than just that. I think, for example, we would all agree we want at least some air traffic control, don't we? We want an interstate highway system, it seems to me. We want some scientific research. We want some student aid. All of those things would be in jeopardy if we think we're going to have just a $2.4 trillion federal government.
Would you favor the President's proposal that everyone making more than $1 million pay at least a 30% income tax rate?
I'm not sure that 30% is the right number, but I certainly would create a minimum tax rate for people making more than $1 million. Yes, I would.
Do we have any idea of what in general the tax rate is that's actually paid by people making over $1 million?
Well, look at Mitt Romney. I mean, he made $21.6 million in the last year, and he paid an effective tax rate of 13.8%. Now, I'll guarantee you that your effective tax rate was higher than that. I know for a fact that my effective tax rate was higher than that, and I make a fraction, and I would guess you do, of the 21.6.
Well, he would say, of course, that he donated almost another 10 or 15%.
Well, that's his call. But the fact that he was able to shelter a great deal of his income offshore, and the fact that he was able to call another part of his income carried interest and thus have a maximum rate of 15%, whereas, earned income has a maximum rate of 35%. I mean, I think these are things in the tax code that at a minimum we have to look at very carefully and I think change. But thus far, there's no political will to even take on these issues for assessment.
No, he would say that that's the strategy that we've pursued in this country, which is that he had a firm that was basically an equity firm that invests in companies, and that's how you stimulate the economy and you grow businesses, create jobs. Right. And that's what grows the economy, and that's why we've given people like that put their capital at risk, because they also could lose money. You give them this effective lower tax rate. I
don't want to fixate on
So do you agree with a lower tax rate for people who invest like that, is what I meant asking, actually.
If it is true job creation, how many jobs has Mitt Romney created? I mean, he described himself as unemployed. But here,
We said 120,000, maybe 10,000.
let me share with you two statistics. Okay, corporate profits as a percentage of gross domestic product, a number we've been measuring since World War II, higher than they've ever been. So we're climbing our way, clawing our way out of a recession, and corporate profits are off the chart in terms of the size of the economy. Total payroll compensation as a percentage of gross domestic product, lower than they've ever been. So this is the disparity that we're dealing with. So the question we have to ask ourselves, if corporate profits are already at an all-time high, on what basis would we conclude that if we just juice corporate profits a little bit more by reducing the tax rate a little bit, that all of a sudden that'll be enough to create jobs, but right now higher than they've ever been, and they're not creating jobs. Jobs are not being created, not because of the tax rate, but because of an absence of demand. And the way you stimulate demand is with spending. If 70% of our economy is rooted in consumer spending and payroll compensation is lower than it's ever been, is it any wonder that spending is down? Of course it's down.
Would you say that being a millionaire on Long Island is different from being a millionaire elsewhere? And is that why you would hedge a little bit about what the tax rate?
That's one of the reasons why I would hedge on whether the 30% number is the right number. $1 million on Long Island is a lot of money, don't get me wrong, but it's not as much money as $1 million in Wyoming or $1 million in Utah. And so I think we have to look at what the right rate is and try to come up with a rate that's right. But I think in the same way that the alternative minimum tax was designed to create a minimum rate. Now, of course, it wasn't properly designed, and it's now really a middle class and upper middle class tax increase. But it was designed to be a minimum tax for high-end earners. We have to look at a minimum tax for high-end earners that actually works, and we have to at a minimum peg it to inflation, peg the number to inflation.
All right, we have to take another break right now. Congressman Tim Bishop in his 5th term. Is he going to go for a 6th term? We'll find out when we return.
TV 10 and 55 Focus continues.
And we're back here with our guest, Representative Tim Bishop, Democrat from Southampton, and in your 5th term. And you've definitely been in one of the hot seats of congressional districts on Long Island. You're frequently targeted by the National Republican Committee. Recently, they were putting out a press release about your opposition to Keystone, and how you should be in favor of it. And I think you just gave a much more nuanced answer here, and that you're open to what the possibilities are there. And this has happened in your previous re-election efforts, where you've actually been targeted to be defeated, and yet here you are. Are you surprised by the kind of attention you get?
Not really. I would first say that the National Republican Campaign Committee is not renowned for the accuracy of their attacks, but I guess that comes with the territory. But no, I'm not surprised. I mean, this was a seat that it has gone back and forth. In the 60s, it was held by a Democrat. 70s and 80s, both Democrats and Republicans. In the 90s, mostly Republicans. I beat a Republican incumbent. So it's a swing seat, and people see it as a pickup opportunity. The Republicans clearly do. So it doesn't surprise me. Every race I've been in, I have considered to be a tough race. I mean,
very close race last time.
No one gave me a shot when I won the first time in 2002. I was able to, in 2010, survive, obviously by a very narrow margin.
Big Republican year.
But it was probably the worst year for a Democratic incumbent that we'll experience in our lifetime.
And you won by?
I won by 593 votes. I would have liked a more comfortable margin, but still in all, I was able to win. So
Randy Altshuler apparently looking for a rematch.
That's my understanding. Yeah, he has declared. George Demos has declared. So if they both persist, then there will be a Republican primary at some point. We don't know what the date of the primary will be.
You're unopposed in your own party.
I'm unopposed on my side. Yes. But as it stands now, the Republicans will have a primary, and I think the primary will probably be sometime in August, as opposed to when it's now scheduled to be in September. So at some point, I'll know who my opponent is, and then I will, look forward to a very spirited race with that opponent.
And what are you going to run on?
I'm going to run on my record. I'm very proud of the work that I and my staff have done for our district. I think our constituent service is unparalleled. Frankly, we've in 9 years, we've closed successfully over 15,000 cases. I'm going to run on my record of being a nonpartisan problem solver that brings the federal government to the table to help local officials solve local problems. I mean, we just finished dredging the Lake Montauk Harbor. There was no money allocated for that project in the budget, in the Army Corps budget. The supervisor of the town of East Hampton came to me, a Republican, by the way. The fishing community of Montauk came to me and said, we got to fix this. I dug in, got the Army Corps to allocate the money to do it, and it's now dredged, and that harbor is now open. It's the most active commercial fishing port in the state of New York. It's something very important to do. I do that over and over again. So I'm proud of the work that I do. I'm proud of the advocacy that I provide for the middle-class families of this district, and I also know this district, every inch of it, and I believe that I'm supported by the people of this district.
You know, you had a close race, but you did win in a year when Republicans picked up seats elsewhere, and so that was not an easy victory in the face of a year that was clearly good for Republicans. And the attack for Republicans on you was that you were somebody that was a big supporter of President Obama and his approach on stimulating the economy with the various programs that the president pursued. Some called them bailouts, others called them necessary to save the country's economy and prevent a depression. Where do you place yourself now as far as how ardently do you support President Obama?
You know, there are policies that the president...
What do you disagree with him?
Well, I disagree with him on a couple of things. I disagree with him on charter schools, for example. I'm not a big fan of charter schools. I disagree with him on trade. I voted against the trade bills because I think they're going to hurt American jobs. I disagree with him on an element of healthcare reform called IPAB, which is the creation of an independent board that would set Medicare reimbursement rates. I think those rates are better set by the Congress, which is how we've historically done it, and I think it's one of the prerogatives of Congress. So those are a couple of areas where I disagree with him on. But I mean, I also agree with him on. I agree that the Republican approach is the best thing for government to do is get out of the way and let the free market prevail. Guess what? That's what we did. The period from 2001 to 2009 was an 8-year-long experiment in Republican economic principles. Trickle-down economics, supply-side economics, and deregulatory economics, and look what it led to. It led to the worst economic collapse we've had since the Great Depression. So I think what the Republicans are proposing is more of the same, and what they're proposing is precisely what got us into the mess that we got into come the fall of 2008. I think that there is a role for government to play. There's not a doubt in my mind that the Troubled Asset Relief Program saved the financial system from absolute collapse, and there's not a doubt in my mind that the reason we've had 22 consecutive months of private sector job growth is because of the efforts that were undertaken in part to stimulate the economy. Let's remember that the last 14 months of the Bush administration, we had job losses every single month totaling 4 million jobs.
Who would President Obama rather run against, you think, right now? Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, Rick Santorum?
I don't know, and it's
And does it matter?
I think it matters, but my guess is that still, it's a very murky field right now, but my guess is that Romney has to still be viewed as the front runner. But it's been a bit of a circus over there on that side. And,
does Newt Gingrich polarize
I think he's one of
some
the more,
regions?
I think he's one of the more intensely polarizing figures in public life right now.
Is he being underestimated, though? Is there something the Republican supporters know that we don't?
He's been given up for dead twice on the Republican side. But he remains an intensely polarizing figure. He remains a figure nationally with disapproval ratings that eclipse his approval ratings. But could he be the Republican nominee? Yeah, he could.
Yes, he certainly would be combative in a fall election. We know that.
Indeed, he would. Well, look at the way he's taken apart Romney and Santorum.
Well, we're out of time, but we want to thank you for coming on. We know now about your plans to run again. Thank you, Congressman Tim Bishop, Democrat from Southampton. And thank you for being there. I'm Richard Rose. Be sure to join us next week for yet another edition of Focus.